History as it happens, June 29th, 2023. Our Radical Declaration, Part 1.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,
that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Because of our founders' central faith that through democracy and individual rights, ordinary people have it within their means to forge a nation that's more just and more equal and more free.
Every American recognizes the famous words penned in the summer of '76, the soaring language of Enlightenment philosophy, establishing fundamental human equality as the guiding principle of the new nation. Or did the revolutionaries really mean something else? Americans have ever contested the meaning of the revolution, and in some ways the debates today are no different than they've always been. That's next with Sean Wilentz and Jim Oakes as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I think the question you're asking, though, Martin, is whether the revolution has suddenly become a source of division, which it wasn't before. I suppose that's true up to a point, up to an extent. I mean, there's this argument now about whether the revolution was pro-slavery or not, which I think is an argument that's not going to last so long, because I don't think that the argument is a particularly interesting one, because I think that the answers are pretty straightforward. But yeah, I mean, at the moment, everything is more divisive in American history than it was before.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate...
Hold on a second. Who are you and what are you doing here?
Why, I'm Thomas Jefferson.
You're not Thomas Jefferson. You don't even sound like him. Get the hell out of here. Well, I hope my guests forgive my uncharacteristically silly start to the podcast. No actual Revolutionary War cannons were used in the taping of this episode. I don't even know what that was. Trying to remake 1776, maybe? Unfortunately, the casting did not work out. All right, we'll get serious now. Not too serious, but serious enough, because I do have a great lineup of scholars coming your way. This is the first in a series of episodes about our Radical Declaration and the enduring importance of the American Revolution. The meaning of the revolution has always been contested, and nowadays the battle over how to teach the American story is very intense. The history wars rage on, producing competing narratives. The 1619 Project, to name one, and at the other end of the spectrum, Hillsdale College's 1776 curriculum. But I say you don't have to subscribe to either. Go to a library or a bookstore instead, and you'll find plenty of books written by historians like Sean Wilentz and Jim Oakes that'll enrich your understanding of the past without the knee-jerk political tribalism pitting Americans against one another. So in these coming episodes, I intend to approach the Declaration from a number of different angles, as a philosophical source of egalitarianism and anti-slavery activism, as a political document designed to address the exigencies of war, as a source of controversy then and now. After all, the primary author was a lifelong slave owner. The subject may be old, but the issues are fresh. The American Revolution is current events. And the Declaration of Independence is the most recognizable, enduring document from a revolution that created our liberal society. But our revolution was incomplete. A civil war followed about 80 years later, and even today we're still trying to achieve its full promise. Princeton Sean Wilentz is the author of The Rise of American Democracy, among many superb books and essays. Jim Oakes is the author of Freedom National, among many superb books and essays. They've become semi-regular guests on the podcast, and they are back to kick off this series. Sean Wilentz, welcome back, my friend.
Great to be here, Martin.
And Jim Oakes, welcome back.
Thank you. Great to be here, too.
Time does fly. Pardon the cliche. You both were with me for a three-way conversation about a year ago. We talked about, well, what was it? Oh, my Slavery and the Constitution series. So we're going to kind of return to that issue today. We're talking about the Declaration of Independence. We're going to talk about what Sean calls the anti-slavery revolution. But first, big picture here. For most of my life anyway, the Revolutionary Era was a source not necessarily of unity because, we Americans have always debated the meaning of the revolution, but rather, in my view, an origin story that served as a universal source of inspiration. As Gordon Wood put it, all of our egalitarian ideals and egalitarian language stem from the revolution and that natural rights ideology that is in the Declaration itself. While it was the Civil War that continued to divide us, not the revolution. Do you see that changing, Sean Wilentz?
Interesting question. Well, first of all, the American Revolution was not so united. Let's just remember. There was a civil war as well. A third, John Adams said a third supported it, a third were indifferent, and a third opposed it. There was division then. We may not see it so clearly, but it was there. And it actually has something to do with what happened with the Civil War, because some of the divisions were about issues of slavery as well. Let's not forget that the issue of slavery was there long before the Civil War was about to happen. It was there actually present in the 1770s.
Right.
That said, to be sure, look, there was a war, it was the one war where part of America, at least until Vietnam, where part of America had actually lost. And it was a civil war. So civil wars are particularly brutal, and the memory was there. And there are those who argue that, in fact, the South ended up winning the Civil War. At least they won the peace in some ways, and they did, at least in terms of who controlled Southern politics.
And the textbooks, too.
Yeah. So I think the question you're asking, though, Martin, is whether the revolution has suddenly become a source of division, which it wasn't before. I suppose that's true up to a point, up to an extent. There's this argument now about whether the revolution was pro-slavery or not, which I think is an argument that's not going to last so long, because I don't think that the argument is a particularly interesting one, because I think that the answers are pretty straightforward. But yeah, at the moment, everything is more divisive in American history than it was before. So I don't know that the revolution should be any exception.
Jim Oakes, what do you think of that?
No, I agree. I do think that the revolution has become a source of public divisiveness in a way that it wasn't, at least in my earlier years. Whereas the Civil War, as you say, always has been. Ironically, it is the issue of slavery that is at the center of the new divisiveness about the revolution, which has always been the issue that has caused division about how you read the Civil War. I hope I can be as optimistic as Sean that this won't last very long, because the evidentiary basis for a pro-slavery revolution is so pathetically thin, and the overwhelming evidence that it introduced into really Western politics, a serious abolition idea, a serious abolition politics, is so clear that I hope Sean's right, that the pro-slavery reading of the American Revolution will eventually disappear.
Beyond the pro-slavery argument, and I agree, the evidence for it is pretty flimsy to non-existent. The idea, and I think maybe this has come about a little bit more post-2020 and, the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protest, etc., the 1619 Project, that the revolution really wasn't a revolution. It may have benefited some people, but for most people, not much changed. And, the principles weren't lived up to immediately, so therefore there's nothing to aspire to. You know what I'm getting at, Sean.
Well, that's an older argument. That goes back a very long way. There are different versions of it. There's an argument that there was a real revolution, but then the Constitution came along and was like Thermidor and undid the radicalness of the revolution or whatever. There's an argument that it was very conservative, right? That from the very beginning, it was more about reclaiming the rights of freeborn Englishmen than anything else. And it was the crown and the parliament that were getting out of line, and they were simply restoring what they had lost. That's another argument that's very familiar. In my own way of thinking, I think that what came out of the 60s and 70s was something very, very different, which was that there was a fundamental revolution, that it was not simply a political revolution or a constitutional revolution, although it obviously was that, but it was a social revolution as well, in which entire forms of social life that had been unquestioned before, say, 1760, all of a sudden are treated with disgust, or at least opprobrium. They're no longer, you can't do these things anymore. It's a bit like what we're living through now in lots of ways. America's always doing this in some ways. But certainly by the time you get to 1800, people are talking about, just take the word democracy, which in the 1760s was thought of as, you say it with a sneer. By the 1800, they're electing Thomas Jefferson on the idea that he's more democratic than his Federalist opponents. For that alone, the decline of deference, all of the ways in which social forms changed as a result of the revolution, made it a social revolution, not in the sense of the Russian Revolution with an ideology that was about, the dictatorship of the proletariat. No, that's not what happened. But egalitarianism is not just a bunch of words. It's not even just a bunch of legal forms. It's a way of life. And that's what the revolution brought about.
Yeah, and Jim, as you've written about this in your book, Freedom National, you came at it from the other end of the timeline, right? You kept going further back, and you see these ideas, the challenge to the chattel principle in slavery, going back further and further and further.
That idea even goes back way before the revolution, but the revolution turned it into a politics and an actual project of getting rid of slavery. I think Sean's absolutely right that even in the most old-fashioned terms, the repudiation of monarchy, the repudiation of the idea of an inherited nobility in a house of its own, with a chamber of its own, those are crucial because they're all related to conceptions of how the social order is supposed to be arranged, right? So I tell my students, imagine if, I thought about this when you had your interview with Jack Raycove a week or two ago, and he said the intention of the Declaration of Independence was not to establish a new revolutionary ideology, but to do blah, 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 blah. That's true. But imagine if the famous second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that some men are born high and mighty and others low and despicable, and that the obligation of the people at the top is to take care of and protect the people at the bottom in return for the loyalty and deference of the people at the bottom to the people at the top. And having foregone that obligation, we therefore separate ourselves. The intention of the document would be the same, but it would have a completely different meaning and a completely different conception of the relationship between government and society, the relationship of human beings to one another, things like that. And I think that egalitarian framing, it just affected everything from that point on. And I do think you asked in the notes you sent around yesterday if ordinary people, responded to that or were influenced by that. And I think the evidence is very clear that they did. My stuff is the slavery stuff. And right away, Americans were saying, if you believe that all men are created equal, if you believe that every human being is entitled to the right to liberty, to the natural right of liberty, then we can't have slavery anymore, right? Blacks were saying that, free blacks were saying that, slaves were invoking that. So it is profoundly influential. It's profoundly influential and has profound social revolutionary implications.
And my question was whether the ideology espoused in the Declaration, John Locke and others who espoused natural rights, whether that was audible at the level of ordinary people. I think yes, even if they hadn't read John Locke.
Well, yeah, but they read the Declaration and they're citing it. It's funny. Historians like to cite this reactionary Tory, Samuel Johnson, saying, you Americans, why is it the loudest yelps for liberty come from the holders of slaves and things like that? Well, it doesn't much matter that a reactionary Tory was saying that kind of stuff. What matters is that Americans were saying that stuff. Americans were immediately saying, look, we say we're committed to universal liberty. We're saying that every human being has a natural right to freedom. Why are we doing this? Why are we continuing? The hypocrisy argument is just an abstract rhetorical point until it gets transformed by people who are invoking it to justify abolishing slavery.
Correct.
Yeah, Sean, you had a bone to pick with Samuel Johnson and the uses of him by historians in a recent lecture you delivered here in Washington.
It's become Samuel Johnson's most famous line, which is a throwaway in a pamphlet he wrote attacking the American Revolution, attacking the idea of that taxation was tyranny. And it was considered a failure, actually, at the time. All his friends kind of were embarrassed and they didn't know what to do with it because he was so reactionary in this piece. And he has this one throwaway line where he says, why is it that the loudest yelps for liberty come from the drivers of slaves or something like that?
Right.
And it's just a throwaway line. It has nothing to do actually with slavery, but nevertheless, got picked up, and once it got picked up, it's authoritative, and it seems to be the voice of the righteous British talking about the horrible Americans who are slaveholders. This is complete bunk. I mean, it's crazy. And as Jim said, right from the beginning, in 1776, there are slaves, free blacks, white people all saying, well, if this is what the revolution is about, why do we still have slavery? We have to get rid of it. There's a New Jersey clergyman named Jacob Green who's right on this right away. And you could multiply it many, many times. So Americans are aware that this is a bigger revolution than the Revolution of Independence, that it has meanings for their own society, as well as their separation from Great Britain. And they are citing the Declaration, as Jim says, they're citing it by name. They're saying in the Declaration of Independence, or they say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they just quote it. I was just finding something today from the 90s, but still it's direct. Those words have enormous power. And the reason they have enormous power is because people are ready to hear them. I mean, it's not just that the scales fall from their eyes when they read the Declaration of Independence. There already had been pressure from below and from on top regarding the issue of slavery that had been there. There have been anti-slavery laws being passed in the 1760s. So it's not as if this was suddenly happening. There were two revolutions going on, if you will. There was an anti-slavery revolution, and there was the anti-monarchical revolution, the Republican Revolution. And they weren't exactly the same. They certainly didn't happen in South Carolina in the same kind of way. Nevertheless, they were both going on, and they all grew out of this extraordinary moment in the middle of the 18th century when people began to question in a fundamental way, how society ought to be ordered, as Jim was saying. What is the proper way in which we're going to order ourselves? And these two revolutions were related. They're very intimately related. And when those words come out, as I say, people were ready to hear them.
Rakove, who Jack mentioned before, Jack Rakove, said that the authors of the document, the Declaration, meant that as a people, Americans were entitled to the same rights to self-government as other nations. But as you say, people are free to interpret the Declaration in any way they see fit, right? Especially with all these ideas that are percolating at the time.
But as Jim said, if that's true, and I look, Jack's right, that was the purpose of it, but why did they put it that way? And why was that the way that Jefferson thought that was the way to put it? It makes all the difference.
Yeah. And Jim, you've made the point on the show before about how a long progressive tradition viewed the founding, right, as a source of inspiration and aspiration. And something that Denver Brunsman brought up to me when I recently talked to him about this same issue, something that he's noticed as a professor at George Washington University, that the far left, talking about the really far left and the really far right, in a way have come to agree on something, traveling from opposite ends of the political spectrum. It's all about white supremacy. The founding is about white supremacy. Well, there was a recent book that Sean reviewed that even emancipation was a pro-slaveholder type of farce. Then why did Martin Luther King at the March on Washington talk about the promissory note, right, to which all Americans are heir? Women's rights, July 1848, Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, based on the Declaration of Independence. Ho Chi Minh, September 2nd, 1945, verbatim cites the Declaration of Independence when he declares Vietnamese independence. So that really wasn't a question, but Jim, go ahead. Whatever's on your mind after listening to it.
I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall when I say this because it doesn't seem to make any difference. But I fail to see how the claim that the American Revolution was a white supremacist movement qualifies as a left-wing argument. Why that is considered extreme left-wing, why people who are committed to an extreme form of identity politics are repeatedly referred to by conservatives as Marxists or communists, when there's, in all my experience and in all my personal relations with people, Marxists don't like that stuff, right? They're materialists. They want class arguments, right? They don't want identitarian arguments. And the revival of racialist arguments has never struck me as left-wing. It's something liberals have taken up in ways that I can't fathom. I can't fathom what's going on right now.
Well, I mean, there is a part of it, though, Jim. It has to do with a revival of a certain kind of black nationalism, I think.
But I don't think of that as that's not left-wing ideology.
You and I agree about that. But there was a way in which certain elements of the left, particularly the Communist Party in the 1930s, kind of picked up on that and kind of, battened on to all of that. And it gave it a kind of left-wing patina, which, is still very much there. For example, Malcolm X, who was a reactionary in my view, was published by Pathfinder Press. They were the Trotskyists.
Right.
Now, so there was a way in which there was this convergence, I think begins in the 20s and 30s, but it goes back earlier too, actually, if you talk about the history of Pan-Africanism. Nevertheless, there's this kind of way in which anti-colonialism, Pan-Africanism had a leftist identity. And that's what people will say when they say that this is coming out of the left. My kind of left ain't that kind of left.
Well, it involves the erasure of the whole tradition that I think Martin briefly referred to, the A. Philip Randolph, that whole group of post-30s, 40s, 50s Black intellectuals who came out of it in a very different way, who came at protest and calls for civil rights and economic justice that were inseparable to those people. And that was not the nationalist tradition. And it's a powerful tradition. And I think that the erasure of that tradition in favor of the one you're talking about has been disastrous for our understanding of what Black politics is and ought to be.
And it's a departure from that long progressive tradition that there is progress, right? That our founding, the principles of the founding, the egalitarianism is a source of inspiration to make our society better today. I know a lot of people who don't consider themselves far left or far right, who just kind of shrug their shoulders when it comes to the founding and the Declaration of Independence. Oh, yeah, well, what didn't they accomplish? And I have Gordon Wood's book here, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. I want to get into the radicalism right now. He writes, opening pages, the revolution did more than legally create the U.S. It transformed American society. The changes were radical and they were extensive. To focus, as we are today, apt to do on what the revolution did not accomplish, highlighting and lamenting its failure to abolish slavery and change fundamentally the lot of women, is to miss the great significance of what it did accomplish, made possible the anti-slavery and women's rights movements, etc., etc. I just quoted a couple of lines, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King. I mean, I don't need to tell you guys this, but I think that's what Brunsman was kind of getting at. We've kind of lost sight of that radicalism, and I guess it's understandable. A lot of people don't think our country's going in the right direction today.
I don't think it's going in the right direction either, but not for that, that reason, for an entirely different set of reasons. Yeah. I do think that in any full accounting of the American Revolution, what it did not accomplish has to be there. But it can't be the main story, because it wasn't the main story. And it misses the degree to which the rights of women and the abolition of slavery are hard to imagine outside of the kinds of political traditions and protest traditions that emerged from the American Revolution. As you pointed out, that's the language of the Declaration of Sentiments. That's what Martin Luther King is invoking.
But I would add something to that, Jim, which was that, at least in terms of the history of slavery and anti-slavery, that struggle was already going on in the 1770s. Yep. It wasn't about people just interpreting it later on. So that's right. At the Federal Convention, you have Gouverneur Morris getting up and saying, this is the curse of heaven. This is a terrible thing. Now, that was not new either, that had been around. So the point is there was a struggle over these matters.
Yes.
There was even a struggle. You could say, Abigail Adams, remember the women. There was even that sentiment out there in the 1770s. The point is history is a history of struggle. It's not a history of one stage of evil always predominating, and then you just see how it morphs. There's a struggle over these things. Sometimes the people that are more democratic win, sometimes they lose. It's continuing. But the fact is that a lot of people will tell you that, yes, the language of the revolution got appropriated by all of these wonderful radicals down the line, but that it was a lie when it was said. When it was said, it wasn't really there. Yeah, these are just big, airy words. And then later on, wonderful people pick them up. It's a falsehood because, in fact, the struggle was there from the beginning. All of these struggles in one way or another. I mean, labor, obviously not. There was a different kind of labor system, blah, blah. But nevertheless, many of the struggles that we think about were already present because of what was being opened up in the middle of the 18th century. My teacher, David Bryan Davis, devoted his life to writing about the history of slavery and anti-slavery. And one of the things he kept coming back to in his writings, which were, multifarious, was his awe, really, at what happened, what was going on sometime between, let's say, 1690 and 1750. But that by 1750, a great moral, political awakening had occurred that went even beyond what he was talking about. And there was something that happened in that period, which we have to take account of. But because of what happened, all of these struggles began. Everything was up for questioning in a way that it hadn't been before.
It's important to understand that it's the struggle that continues rather than the tendency of some people see it in Gordon's work, some people see it in Balin's work, the tendency to think that once you set this idea in place, there's a kind of logical, necessary fulfillment, and there isn't. What you get is a struggle, and then it becomes a history of politics, a history of the distribution of power, political economy, all these kinds of things. But it's the struggle that's put in place and at the center of American political life by the American Revolution, I think. I wonder sometimes when people sneer at the principle of fundamental human equality, like, do you not believe it? What is your starting premise?
Yeah, and that's the basis for the politics to get there. Well, Sean, you recently said in your lecture down here, between 1765 and 83, the movement for American independence assembled, expanded, and politicized growing anti-slavery sentiments among non-slaves in the Atlantic world. In large portions of the rebellious colonies, Americans, black and white, concluded the revolution would be incomplete unless it also did away with the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. So this is your anti-slavery revolution, which is not to say the revolution was fought to end slavery. Obviously it wasn't, but that it gave life to these impulses. And as you mentioned to me in an email, you're not uncovering anything new. You are talking about something that people have simply been ignoring.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about traditions in historiography and politics. Benjamin Quarles said much of what I have to say in 1961. It's funny that somehow there's this great discovery about blacks in the revolution. I mean, Benjamin Quarles made all of these points in very, very nuanced ways, I might add. He was a great historian. He's an African-American historian, too, so why people don't want to give him credit is beyond me. But this is not anything new. There's been a great deal of new research, recent research on this, which is extraordinary about, for example, there are some things in the lecture about what was going on in Boston in the 1770s, the great petition campaigns, which people kind of knew about. But there's a lot of new research about all of that, which is fascinating. It's not as if there's nothing new to be said, but yeah, these ideas are nothing old. William Nell was writing about this in the 1850s. I mean, this is nothing new.
In the 1880s, the first book on the history of black soldiers.
Well, but there was
Washington.
There was stuff earlier. There was Liverpool.
Yeah.
There was stuff that, even in the 1860s, people knew about it. People were writing. Crispus Attucks was a hero,
Right.
in the Civil War era. So it's not as if this is new.
Yeah, you say that slavery was on the defensive anywhere was far more remarkable than the fact it still existed, given slavery's virtually unassailable status less than a generation earlier. And we're getting a little bit away from the Declaration here, but that's okay. We'll return to the document in a bit. I think part of the problem is slavery was a lot different. When we think of slavery, we talk about this like monolithic institution. It changed dramatically over time. It got worse as it actually got older, right? What I'm trying to say, Jim, is the slavery of the 1850s is different than the slavery of the 1760s. I don't know if that's relevant to this discussion.
I don't know. I don't know if I would put it that way. I don't think anybody, even at the Constitutional Convention, maybe one or two, anticipated the Cotton Revolution. Right? And there is a palpable sense of shock among anti-slavery Northerners that what they had expected to die was in fact coming back to life in a big way. That they had gotten rid of the Atlantic slave trade only to watch the emergence of this horrific domestic slave trade. And it's all based on a generation that came out of the American Revolution, assuming that slavery was going to die, assuming it was anachronism, that the destiny of the United States was to be completely free. So it's not so much that cotton plantations are worse than tobacco plantations. In many ways, Joyce Chaplin made this argument decades ago, right? The tobacco plantations of the 18th century are in many ways the model for the cotton plantations. It's not that it got worse. And there are all sorts of ways in which, at least in the law, it got milder. The worst kind of abusive punishments for slaves who misbehave are stripped out of the slave codes and things like that. So I wouldn't say that slavery got worse. It just got stronger in a way that no one anticipated. And it led to a pro-slavery politics that was much more aggressive than anything you see in the American Revolutionary era.
That's a better way of putting it. Go ahead, Sean.
What Jim just said. But I mean, maybe I'll add a little bit to that.
Sure.
It's stronger politically as well. Yeah. And, when you're talking about the Federal Convention, for example, in Philadelphia in 1787, basically it's Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Rutledge, a couple of other South Carolinians and the Georgians who were saying, we need slavery, we're going to be outnumbered. And they cut a kind of deal, but it's not a deal that anybody thought was going to instantiate slavery. No one believed that slavery was being instantiated by the U.S. Constitution. Not even the Pinckneys of the world, although they quickly went down to South Carolina and said that was what was going on. But it's one thing to say it, when you're trying to get the thing ratified, another thing to be the reality. But politically, then, I mean, what you see is in the course of the early 19th century and into the 1820s and 30s, what is later going to be known as the slave power, which is not just Southerners in combination with Northerners, comes to dominate the federal government at every level. And that is a change that happens. That was not decreed by the Constitution. It was not decreed by the Revolution. It was something that changed in part because of the Cotton Revolution that Jim is talking about, but also because of how Southern politics operated. Northern politics was much less dominated by a single class than Southern politics was. The people who came to the fore in Southern politics were always the people who were the slaveholders. It was a very complicated, but in some ways very simple fact that the slaveholders became much more powerful politically. They were very good politicians, by the way.
They were. That's right.
History to be written about Southern politics where, they do politics in some ways better than their Northern comrades. But nevertheless, that had changed tremendously. So the slave power is nothing that's there even in 1800, but it's certainly there by 1830, 1840. That's a change. That's an evolution. So in that sense, things are worse from the standpoint of politics in that you didn't have the slave power in 1787, although there are some who argue that you did. I don't buy it. But you certainly have it there. Pick your date. I mean, it doesn't really matter. So that has changed as well.
Thank you for explaining what I meant, both of you. So the Declaration itself, are historians focusing more on the, 27, 28 grievances than the opening lines? Do you see that in the academic world, Sean?
I don't know that I see that, but it could very well be true.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that people are de-accentuating the egalitarian power of the first, third of the document, I suppose that's true. So people want to then look at, there's the line about that Jefferson has there about how the natives, what do they call them? Does he use the word savages? I forget the word he used.
I was actually going to read that grievance. I can do it right now.
Insurrections and so forth. It's completely ahistorical reading of those lines to make it out to be a revolution about white supremacy. You can cherry pick that stuff if you want, or the idea that somehow slavery was the fault of the British monarchy.
Yeah, that didn't make it into the end. They cut that.
I understand, but that people will argue right? But that's a very common argument. My response to that is, well, the slavery was the fault of the British monarchy, actually. At the end of the 17th century, the Stuarts were very, very clear about forming the Royal Africa Company and trying to do their best to instantiate slavery in the American colonies. And when they're looking back, they're not completely wrong about all of that. Now, is it a way to try to avoid their own culpability? Perhaps. But nevertheless, it wasn't historically an inaccurate view. As for the savage Indian tribes and so forth, again, this is something where they're holding the British responsible for what's going on. Now, we can talk about the later history of American, Indian relations, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole tragic, terrible story that we can go into. But it's not in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is not calling upon, Americans for a genocide of the native population. Yeah. That's just not there.
Yeah, these are grievances directed at King George III rather than Parliament. Parliament's hardly mentioned in the grievances, and of course, the crisis was caused by the colonists challenging Parliament's sovereignty, right? Parliament's supremacy.
You do have to feel kind of sorry for King George because, he wasn't really responsible for all this stuff, and he gets all the blame for political reasons. In fact, George III was a little bit more sympathetic to the colonists than the parliamentary leadership was.
Well, I have Andrew Roberts' huge biography of King George III here. I was going to cite a line or two, but go ahead, James.
Well, I was going to say, many, many years ago, Pauline Maier wrote a book arguing that when the rebellion began in the 1760s, the colonists did focus on Parliament. When they got no relief from Parliament, they switched to focusing on the ministry. When they got no relief from the ministry, they switched to King George, and that happened when 1776 happened. So it's true. It's true, but it doesn't mean they aren't complaining and hadn't been complaining about Parliament and the ministry and all that other stuff. The other thing I think you should mention is that of those 27 grievances, it's that last one that everyone cites. The thing about Indians and the slave rebellions and stuff like that. That sticks out like a sore thumb in that list of grievances. Almost all the other grievances are about British colonial abuse of power. They've prorogued our legislatures. They've quartered troops with us. They've taken our kids off the streets and put them in the army and stuff like that. I don't know that historians are reading the list of grievances more than the first. They're reading the last of the 27 grievances as though that were a reflection of the entire Declaration of Independence and of the independence movement generally.
Yeah, the grievances are essentially complaints that the British Empire is putting down a rebellion, as most imperial projects are wont to do, right? I mean...
But not just a rebellion. They very much assume that political power should rest primarily in representative legislatures. And most of what they're complaining about is that. The legislatures that are supposed to represent us in England are not representing us. The legislatures in the colonies that do represent us have been overruled and stuff like that. So I think that assumption that we should be ruled by representative legislatures is the dominant theme in most of those grievances.
And this gets into the theory.
That tells you something about the revolution and what they're assuming.
This does get into the theories about government, right? Because the British side would argue, well, Parliament does represent your interest. You have a pretty good deal over there.
It's Samuel Johnson all over again.
No.
I mean, the whole point of that pamphlet was to say, taxation, no tyranny. We can tax you as much as we want. We don't give a fig about your representative institutions. We are sovereign, and so forth. The fact that he's defending the greatest slave trading power on earth, it kind of doesn't exactly come across in that pamphlet. But it is that point. That's the point that's being made. That's what the revolution is about. I would just add one small point here about grievance 27, or whatever number it is. Thomas Paine makes this point. Thomas Paine is anti-slavery. You don't have to be pro-slavery in order to be upset about the fact that the British are inciting slaves to kill you. There's a distinction that has to be drawn here about the situation in 1776. So there are anti-slavery people who are also aghast at all this because, they see the British cynically doing this. The British who introduced slavery in the first place, the British Crown, is doing this to us. That's their thinking. Now, we can look back on that and be critical of it, and we should. It's a complicated story. But to read it the way it's being read now, as the be-all and end-all of the revolution, and that it simply is pro-slavery, is a mistake.
We now know that between 85 and 90% of the slaves who were imported into the colonies came on European ships, almost all of them British, right? That the Americans were not very deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade, for a variety of complicated reasons, and couldn't be, right? So a mythology later developed, especially among pro-slavery ideologues, that somehow the North was the source of all the slave trading and stuff like that. But they were right. The colonists were right. It was the British primarily who were bringing slaves to the colonies, not the Americans. The Americans were not deeply involved in Atlantic slave trading.
Some of the legislatures had tried to petition the Crown to get rid of the slave trade, and the Crown officials, would say no. We're going to keep on sending the slaves, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, Sean, you pointed out in your lecture that one southern colony or state actually shut down the slave trade for a while. Was it South Carolina?
This is what's interesting is that people look at the Atlantic slave trade clause in the Constitution, the 20-year delay. I call it a moratorium more than anything else because they give a moratorium saying Congress cannot do this for 20 years. Okay. And they say this is just going to open up the slave trade amazingly. This is what they want to do. Well, the fact was that 3 months earlier, at the South Carolina legislature, including people like Pinckney, had actually shut down the South Carolina slave trade. They had done it for a variety of reasons. It was not a humanitarian act. The economy was not working out, but they shut it down. And they talk about it at the convention. And they say, Pinckney says, well, we're probably going to open it up again, et cetera. They didn't reopen it until 1803. And 1803 is a very different date than 1787. You have the Louisiana Purchase coming through. You had a whole bunch of reasons why you want to reopen the slave trade before they're going to close it in 1808. And everybody knew they were going to close it in 1808, 1807, 1808. So my point here is only that the whole history of the slave trade has been, as Jim was saying, has been completely, well, not completely, but has been manipulated, has been misread in ways that actually take away from the struggle that's going on, because there is a struggle over the slave trade. It goes back to the 1750s and 1760s. And unless you see that as crucial to what's going on in the revolution, you're missing an important aspect of the revolution itself.
Yeah.
In principle, the Commerce Clause should have precluded the states from being allowed to close off the slave trade. And in fact, I think all but one state did close off the slave trade, shut down the slave trade. So it was clearly understood that, I think it was pretty clearly understood that when you talk about the slave trade, you're talking about slavery. It's an indispensable part of slavery. What the Constitution does is, for the first time, sever slave trading from slavery in a way that allows the federal government to stop any southern state from importing any more slaves from outside the United States.
Yeah. First time.
Nothing like that had ever been done.
Yeah. And that applies to many of these issues here. This was the first abolitionist movement in Western history, right? So back to the grievances, I just want to read the language in all the grievances are a sentence or two, so this won't take long. So the final grievance, he has excited, meaning the king, he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So Andrew Roberts, who writes a favorable biography of King George III, he also wrote a favorable biography of another autocratic type, Napoleon. He goes one by one through all the grievances and picks them apart, but he still says the American Revolution was justified because of the taxation issue. Whatever one thinks of each of these grievances, and I'm not going to go through all of them, whether they're all accurate or exaggerations, Roberts is right about the last few. To Sean and your point, Jim, about how these have been manipulated, these were ex post facto justifications for a rebellion that was already underway. Which brings us to the recent controversy over Dunmore and all this stuff. The war is already underway for more than a year by the time we get to 1776. It's actually quite interesting. I've just been reading some of Jack Rakove's work about the timing and why it took as long as it did to get all the way to independence. The deliberative process of these very British elites, right? It also took time for news to cross the Atlantic. So they were deliberative, news traveled slowly, and for a while they were trying to reconcile. So all of that affects the timing of the formal Declaration of Independence in summer of 76. Sean.
Well, rebellion and the independence are two different things.
Yeah.
Right? There's always the chance that you can reconcile the Olive Branch petition and all the rest of it. There are attempts to try to look. There are a lot of people in the United States. A lot of people are going to end up being patriots who are not really red hot for independence right away, even after Lexington and Concord. They are moving in that direction, and they're moving there pretty quickly, but it takes time for that to actually come about, where you're going to get together in Philadelphia and sign a document to that effect. Yeah. There are people who are going to be dragging their feet on that particular issue.
It was a deliberative process, but at the same time, the first Congress meets in autumn of 1774, and in less than 2 years, we have independence. So in a way, it's a short period of time, too. You'll get it that way.
It's true. And one of the things that the First Continental Congress does is to pull the colonies out of the slave trade, which is something that needs to be remembered as well.
Yeah. These questions of timing are always interesting. It goes back to the slave trade issue. Often people who don't want to deal with a substantive issue like the Constitution gave Congress the power to abolish the slave trade will switch to the question of why did it take so long for them to do it, right? We get this during the Civil War, right? Why did it take Lincoln so long to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, as though 18 months is such an extraordinary period of time that it calls out for explanation, right? As opposed to, why is there an Emancipation Proclamation? What is going on that the Constitution includes for the first time in history a clause empowering the central state to shut down the slave trade? That's the big issue. The timing is secondary. Right? It's not that it's not there and something you should pay no attention to. It's just it's the secondary issue. The big issue is what they actually did about the slave trade, what Lincoln does about the proclamation and stuff like that. So I'm a little leery of, historians have two big tools. We have context and we have chronology, right? Both of them are very powerful and they're very straightforward, but they're very easily subject to abuse. Right? You can contextualize any horrific thing out of existence, out of significance by showing it was so much worse elsewhere or something like that, Or you can manipulate chronology in such a way as to make it look like something was caused because A happened prior to C, when in fact the two may have nothing to do with one another.
With regard to the slave trade clause, as Jim says, it was the first major serious attack on the Atlantic slave trade in the Western world undertaken in the name of a national government. That's what's happening here. And, they managed to get a delay for 20 years, not so much to reopen the slave trade, because they just closed the slave trade to South Carolinians, but more or less to make sure that they get the thing ratified by the South Carolinians. The planters down south did not want to give up that authority over the slave trade. They were very jealous of that authority. Even then, the compromise was not as dirty as people make it out to be. There was a compromise, but they were happy to make it. Madison gets ticked off because they extended to 20 years. My point is only this, that it's very convenient to undercut something that's of world historic importance by saying, but it should have been more the way I wanted it to be, or the way it should have been quicker. Well, that's not historical.
The point I was also trying to make about chronology is that, you see this in the way people abuse the significance of the Dunmore Proclamation. The fact that it happened 8 months prior to the Declaration of Independence must mean that the Declaration of Independence was caused by this prior event. And there's no reason to believe that. What's interesting, despite the fact that Woody Holton has become one of the people we most disagree with on this issue, his book suggests a very different reading of Dunmore's proclamation, right? The goal of Dunmore's proclamation was to bring the planters into the king's side, onto the British side. There is some evidence that actually worked for some planters, whereas there is precious little evidence that Virginia planters switched over to independence because of Dunmore's proclamation. There does appear to be some evidence that the goal of the proclamation did work, in that some planters said, oh boy, if that's what they're going to do, I'm going with the British.
Yeah, exactly. I learned that in an article I read at the Journal of the American Revolution online. Yeah, Holton is more measured in his book than he is in public and on the Hulu docuseries.
Can I give a plug to the Journal of American History, which is American Revolution online, which is an excellent publication, and recommend it to your listeners.
Yeah, I'm looking for the footnote in the article here. Just stand by.
They even have footnotes. I mean, it's really good.
Dunmore reported his proclamation received an immediate and positive reception when over 100 former rebels signed loyalty pledges the day after he issued it.
There you are.
Yeah.
Nothing like that happens in the opposite direction that I know.
There are 3 or 4 that you can name that say, oh, well, I'm really pissed off now, and I'm going to be signed the Declaration. You can count them on 2 hands. Not 100, that's for sure.
Yeah, Dunmore estimated 3,000 Virginians pledged to support the royal government after his proclamation. Yeah,
that's really important, because it's not out there.
Yeah, I hope I did not mean to imply that the Declaration should have or could have been done earlier. What I found interesting about the timing is that you see the beginnings of national politics, to borrow the title of one of Jack Rakove's books. And Sean, by extension, in your recent lecture here in Washington about the beginnings of anti-slavery politics and activism, you bring up the name of a fella, Felix Holbrook, 1773. Who was he and why is this important?
Felix Holbrook was an enslaved man in Boston in 1773 who got up a petition. He was petitioning the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, and asking basically for freedom and speaking actually in the name of a larger black community. It's a very deferential, quote unquote, petition. It's very respectful. These petitions are going to get more angry as time passes. But this is before the Declaration of Independence. Okay, this is my point, is that this movement, this anti-slavery movement, this grasping onto, holding on to ideas of natural rights, etc. This is not a religious thing. It's very much couched in the language you're going to see later on in the revolution. There's a series of petitions that begin with him, and he has a bunch of friends. They continue right up to, I guess they go through 1774, 74. They're tied to members of the general court. They have friends in high places, and they're very sophisticated in going about trying to get that support. And they actually get debates inside of the general court about abolition in Massachusetts, led by, among others, James Otis, the man who was coming up with the idea of no taxation without representation that Samuel Johnson was angry about. Anyway, my point is that there is call it a movement. There is a movement in Massachusetts, at any rate, a petition movement that becomes much larger, that involves large numbers of enslaved Bostonians and the area around Boston, with white office holders, with white abolitionists of various kinds. It's very much there. And that's in the, before the American Revolution, before the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. Some people might be astonished to learn that an enslaved woman named Mum Bet, name given to her by her owner, of course, and an enslaved man, Quock Walker, they sued for their freedom, or they were suing to as a test to see whether the new Massachusetts Constitution had effectively abolished slavery. I mean, this is really important to know, Jim, as someone who's traced the origins of anti-slavery politics in the United States leading up to the Civil War. This is the origins of it.
Yeah, the freedom suits are very important and very interesting. And one of the most interesting things about them is that, like running away, it works in some places and it doesn't in other places. A slave who sues for freedom in South Carolina is not going to work.
Even in New Jersey. I mean,
right. It works in Massachusetts and it doesn't work in the southern colonies. Just like John Hope Franklin and Lawrence Schreiniger showed years ago that 50,000 slaves a year ran away, 95% of them in the South, and they always got sent back, right? But cross the Mason-Dixon line, cross the Ohio River, and run into a different legal, political world, and it has a different consequence. So suing for your freedom is very important to understand the process by which emancipation happens in northern places like Massachusetts, but it tells you something about the context of Massachusetts that is possible there in a way that it's not possible, which gets to the point Sean made earlier. This is going to be about a conflict. One of the big conflicts that emerges when we talk about a conflict over slavery that comes out of the American Revolution, it is very largely a sectional conflict because northern states abolish slavery and southern states don't. The slavery controversy becomes a sectional controversy. Yeah. And sue for your freedom in New England, and you'll get one result. Sue for your freedom in Georgia, and you'll get a different one.
I mean, even before Quock Walker and Elizabeth Freeman, there were Massachusetts, all white juries in Massachusetts were freeing slaves who were sued, simply saying that slavery is illegal. That was already going on. But there's another point to be made here about those particular trials, is the collaborative nature of it. Right. Elizabeth Freeman actually was enslaved by a big patriot, and she's listening to all this stuff about natural rights, and it's coming to her. But she goes to a lawyer. I think she went to Sedgwick. I can't remember all the names, but they go to white lawyers who are also patriots, who are also anti-slavery, and they collaborate in this argument about how the Massachusetts Constitution had actually gotten rid of slavery in 1780. And one of the things that's also been lost in all of this is the idea that the patriots are all white on one side and the slaves are all on the other side. And in fact, there's an anti-slavery collaboration that's going on right from the very beginning. That has been completely ignored. And it goes to your point earlier, Martin, about the different versions of how we understand American. The interracial aspects of these things have been completely, or not completely, they have been largely overlooked. The idea is that all white people were on one side and all black people are on the other side. That's what you're going to reduce it to. And maybe there's some white people that were okay, but really, no. From the very start, this is a collaborative. It can only be.
It had to be. Right.
Because, every black insurrection had been crushed. You weren't going to get very far doing it that way. You were going to get, however, going through the courts, going through the legislatures, but it necessarily had to be collaborative. When I say collaborative, too, I don't mean it's just as if, the slaves aren't bringing much to the table. They're bringing a lot to the table. It really is a genuine collaboration. But that, too, has been lost. Yeah, and that's what Martin Luther King is in many ways is talking about.
The promissory note. Maybe we should wrap up with something that you pointed out in your lecture, Sean, that it really resonated with me, and it's why I'm bothered by so much pessimism, if we'll call it that. Fashionable pessimism about our founding, and that is not to idealize it either, like the 1776 curriculum might do. You don't have to be a flag-waving loony to understand. We're trying to understand why things happen here, right? So you talk about how even at the time, enslaved people, who of course needed no convincing about the evils of slavery, you mention an enslaved man in Connecticut, Bristol Lambie, who directed a freedom petition to the Sons of Liberty in Connecticut. Even then, enslaved people, who of course can see that the revolution is not going to end slavery itself, right, are drawing inspiration from its principles to say, okay, we need to go further.
Yeah, I mean, Bristol Lambie is a man in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, named Nero Brewster. They have a Negro election day, and he's always elected king every year, who also gets up a petition.
You named two slaves, Prime and Prince. Slaves often didn't have
that's later on in Connecticut. Yeah. I mean, there's actually something of a connection, a collaboration going across the state about these things.
Yeah, with the Fairfield Sons of Liberty, so a white group, presumably. They're working with these two.
I think the secretary of the Fairfield Sons of Liberty actually wrote the petition, or one of the petitions. I mean, as I say, it's a collaboration that's going on, and it involves people. Look, one of the things that's not often talked about, going back to loyalists and slavery, it's not the case that all slaveholders were loyalists. That's not the case. Obviously, a lot of slaveholders were patriots. But I believe it's true that most, if not all, anti-slavery whites are patriots. There are very few loyalist anti-slavery people. You don't see that many of them. You see them in Britain from far away being able to lob bombs against James Otis and so forth with Samuel Johnson. But that's a much more cynical view. On the ground, the connection is between not just white people and the enslaved, but it's actually between white patriots and the enslaved.
There's a little appreciated precedent that comes out of the American Revolution that does involve loyalists, and that is the fact that the Americans and the British are confiscating loyalist estates. And in the southern states, when they confiscate slaves, they more or less redistribute them or sell them and feed them up. But in the North, loyalist estates are confiscated and the slaves are emancipated, right? That is the crucial precedent for what's going to happen during the Civil War. It's the legal rationale. Once you've confiscated the estate in, the Confiscation Acts, confiscate slaves during the Civil War, the slave formally becomes the property of the state, and the state doesn't want to hold that person as a slave and therefore emancipates the slave. That is the direct legal precedent that's going to become revolutionary in its implications when the Civil War happens. And it comes right out of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
There is one northern state where I think they don't do it, New Jersey and so forth, and the governor was forever, regretted. He said that was the turning point, was when we didn't do that.
Benjamin Quarles says that the New Jersey legislature 3 times passed laws confiscating and emancipating the slaves of loyalists.
I mean, it may not be New Jersey. I remember getting my state wrong, but there's one that gets it off.
Maybe I'll look that up when we're done here. But yeah, Jim, your book, Crooked Path to Abolition, talks about military emancipation following, the Treaty of Paris after the Revolutionary War, Treaty of Ghent after the War of 1812.
It just becomes accepted American law that in wartime, states have a right, belligerents have a right to confiscate and emancipate enemy slaves. In the long history of slavery, throughout the history of the world, that's a reversal. In the long history of slavery, war is the single most important source of slaves. When you attack an enemy, you enslave enslave them en masse. Now, for the first time in the 18th century, and particularly during the American Revolution, the reverse has happened.
All this complexity, nuance, all this history, this makes it hard to subscribe to one or the other. You're either with the 1619 camp or the 1776 camp. There was a New York Review of Books review recently written by Adam Hochschild talking about the 1776 curriculum versus the 1619 project. There are libraries full of books written by historians like yourselves. You don't have to be one or the other.
But isn't that a reflection on our politics today?
Yes.
Which could become so polarized. It's fallout from that. But history naturally becomes the battleground upon which these politics are often played. So that you're going to get, say, the 1619 Project by the Times trying to get more readers. And of course, you're going to get Trump doing his 77. It's all politicized. That was not the case when Jim and I were growing up. You didn't find that degree of polarization. You had differences. You had struggles of all kinds. But in terms of the way that the politics would be presented between the parties, we're in a different place than we were before.
And it's not really helping people get a better understanding of the past.
No,
it's just causing
it's not.
confusion. So.
It's look, for a lot of reasons, the historical profession is in great trouble, I think, and has to do with the decline of the humanities, has to do with a lot of different things. But this is also symptomatic of that people feel that they have to go to one side or the other rather than to actually reason through things on the basis of the evidence, which is really what we're supposed to be doing. And I worry intensely about the future of historical studies, given this polarization, which, it's essentially political, but it's affected everything else.
So a guy walks into a bar, maybe it's me, and there he sees sitting Robert Caro, Sean Wilentz, and Jim Oakes. And he asks, which one of you guys going to finish your book first?
Sean.
No way. My problem is I am writing this book and
about the anti-slavery revolution in our country.
History of anti-slavery from the 1640s, 50s on. I finished the first quarter of it, and that's great, and I was really happy. And then I sent it to my editor, and it's 250 pages long. So, he's expecting another, we'll see.
Another what, 800?
another blockbuster. Well, now this is going to be a 2-volume thing now. I mean, I wrote a book many years ago, called "The Rise of American Democracy."
It's my favorite history book.
That's the first volume of the history of the United States from the Revolution to the Civil War. There's a second volume called "The Fall of American Slavery," and that's volume 2 of the same period. And you can't have one without the other. And the point is to try to put the two together. So it's a 2-volume take on this period, one from democracy rising, the other from slavery falling.
I have mentioned the rise of American democracy probably more than any other book on my podcast.
And we are all very grateful. My editors, my everybody's very grateful.
It's one of my first reference books when I need to refine. I want to reread it, but everybody has too many books to read. Jim, I was kind of kidding around, and I mentioned that you're writing a book about the Civil War. So
my problem is that Sean's talking about a 1,000-page book on the history of the politics of slavery from the Revolution to the Civil War. I need to write that in 100 pages.
Yeah, right.
And it's really hard.
It's harder. It's harder
because it's not possible any longer to start the origins of the Civil War with the Mexican War. It's just implausible to start it there. It makes no sense at all. And the last time I talked to Sean about this, he said, "Oh, but you got to go back to the English Civil War." And I'm thinking, "Oh my God, I just but a 1,500-page origin.
And you can add another 5 pages, Jim, just to get back to the 1640s. It's okay.
That's what has slowed me down, and I'm really struggling with to get it in such a way as to not make it look like somehow all of American history is pointed towards the Civil War and the struggle over slavery. Because I don't think that's the case. Yet I think it's also the case that the origins of the struggle over slavery are long and deep and serious in ways that most books on the origins of the Civil War have not fully taken into account.
Most of these books on the Civil War begin in 1846 or 1848. It's as if something happened then, which is crazy, or maybe
which among other things biases the entire history of the struggle over slavery into the territorial issue.
Yes.
When there have always been other issues, particularly the fugitive slave issue.
Well, the Oxford History of the United States, it's conceptualized as breaking history up into periods. So you get 1815 to 1848. Daniel Walker Howe, who mentioned Sean in his book. Your book was better, Sean. I did enjoy Daniel Walker Howe's book on that period, but yours is much better. And then you get McPherson's classic, 1848 to 1865, and then,
Same thing happened with the New American Nation series. David Potter is required to start in the Mexican War. But the fact that he was required to do so and that McPherson was required to do so tells you something about the general thinking about where the origins of the Civil War are.
Sean Wilentz and Jim Oakes, we thank you. And my recommendation to all of you listening, check out their work. Check out their books. You will be the better for it. On the next episode of History as It Happens, our series on the Radical Declaration continues with Jack Rakove as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.